Ladies and gentlemen, the Building Code Advisory Board meeting for July 16th, 2020 is officially called to order. Will the secretary please call the roll?
Yes. Cheryl Cheney,
Present.
Dan Cuppet, Jim Johansson,
Present.
Dave Rhodes, Blake Tomlinson,
Present.
Daniel Yeager.
Present.
So the only one we have, or the two people we have absent is Dan and Dave. Is that correct?
I believe Dan is here. He probably was just on mute.
Okay. Dan, are you present?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I had to
Thank
click
you.
it twice. I'm present.
I will entertain a motion to excuse Dave Rhodes from tonight's meeting.
I'll second that motion.
Did we have a first?
I'll make the motion that we excuse Dave Rhodes from tonight's meeting.
All in favor?
That was Dan. That was in.
So Dan made the motion and Blake seconded.
Thank you.
Do we need to do a roll call vote? Or can I just ask for anyone voting no?
You can, I think for this, if you can do a roll call, and then for approval of the minutes, it's just if anybody has anything.
Okay. Dan Cupitt,
Yes.
Jim Johansson,
Yes.
Blake Tomlinson,
Yes.
Daniel Yeager,
Yes.
and I, Cheryl Cheney, am also voting yes. Summary of the minutes of the meeting of June 16th, 2020 have been submitted for approval. Are there any corrections or additions to the meeting minutes? Hearing none, the minutes stand approved as printed. At this time, I'm going to request that staff that are present introduce themselves, stating their name and their title.
I'm Brita Van Horn. I'm the building official.
Stephen Parker, Arvada Fire Marshal.
Emily Grogg, Senior Assistant City Attorney.
Stephanie Wallace, Recording Secretary.
And that looks like that's everybody. The first order of business tonight to be reviewed is the proposed adoption of the 2018 International Building and Fire Codes. Brita Van Horn and Stephen Parker are joining us tonight for additional information related to the proposed adoption. And so at this time, I will turn the meeting over to Brita.
Thank you. So last meeting, we actually made it through both ordinances and had some feedback, comments, and some additional information that you wanted, and a few things we wanted to talk about at this meeting. So what I would propose is to actually just go through the high points, and first of all, just confirm the changes that we agreed to or that you guys wanted from the last meeting. And then also, Stephen has additional information to present regarding residential sprinkler systems. And so I'm happy to entertain which order you would like those in. Stephen, do you have a preference?
I don't.
Okay. So I'm going to actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to screen share, and why don't we just keep things in order? Is that fine? In like order that the document came to you, so that we can scroll through it And it should be relatively quick to go through some of this anyway. And then if we need to stop and have a more in-depth discussion on certain areas, we can do that. So I'm gonna just pull up my screen here so you can see it. I love virtual meetings. So what is on page 49 of your packet is, and I would propose, because the end of this document has information that came from our member Dan Cupid, we talk about roofing related issues when we get down toward the bottom, and then also once we can talk about the residential fire sprinkler systems as we go through in the order that the ordinance is written, which will actually be shortly. But I just wanted to highlight a few changes that were made that we discussed from the last meeting. And actually the changes start really in this IRC ordinance section. So this is the section amending the International Residential Code. We made a few changes to the geographic design chart and also the manual J, which is the energy code calculation or the mechanical system calculation chart. So we changed the wind speed to 150 miles an hour V ultimate speed west of Highway 93. We also recommended changing the elevation because we have a variety of elevations. So having a static elevation for the majority of the city, but then everything west of Highway 93 having a variable elevation based on the site. And then having an actual change to the coincident wet bulb to be in line with other jurisdictions. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Did I capture that correctly from the last meeting? I think I did. So the next section actually is in the order it comes in is the discussion about the sprinkler systems for residential, single family, 2-family, and townhomes. And so I'll turn it over to Stephen for this section. He has additional information that you requested. Stephen, do you want me to take off screen share?
I don't think I have anything needing the screen share right now.
Okay, I'll just leave it then.
Okay. So I included in this packet a list of questions that came from the last meeting. I take it everybody's had a chance to review them, but I can quickly go through them line by line if that's what you guys would prefer. Or do you have any specific questions based on the responses?
What are we looking at?
So within the packet, there was an attachment based on an email that was sent asking various questions. So I don't know if you've seen that. I can just go ahead and go question by question. So the first question, and it was somewhat addressed at the last meeting, but it was that there's not enough companies to give competitive quotes for these systems. I did a little more research into that, and currently there's 9 companies that are registered with the State Division of Fire Prevention and Control that only do residential sprinkler systems. But there's 140 companies that are licensed or registered for commercial sprinkler systems. And since that's a higher standard, because those are commercial systems, they do also do residential. So there's just about just shy of 150 companies that have the ability to do residential sprinklers. The next question was there are delays due to scheduling contractors. Really, it's not much different than any trade, whether it's plumbers or mechanical contractors. There could be some challenges with smaller developments, but when we're looking at larger residential developments, it's no different than really any other trade. They typically just bounce from house to house. And the beauty of the larger tract type developments, there's standard floor plans, and we would only require one design for a floor plan and not necessarily have a plan needing to be submitted and reviewed for every floor plan. The next question was, when a residential sprinkler system activates, does the fire department automatically get notified? The answer to that is no, it's not required. but the homeowner can opt to do that with a home security system. The next question was, does this code provision affect additions and remodels? As it is written into the code right now, it's all for brand new construction, so it will not affect additions or remodels. The next question was, is there any cost savings? And if so, how is it passed down to the homeowners? I do believe there's maybe not necessarily a cost savings overall, but there are at least cost trade-offs. You know, the bottom line might be the same. And it was brought up, how's the cost savings or at least breaking even passed down to from a developer to a home builder to eventually a home buyer. Unfortunately, I can't control that, and I don't know, quite honestly, if there is any. But it's been my opinion the whole time is that I do believe that this will cost home buyers money, but it is fairly minimal. We have a small sample size within our jurisdiction, and that's running less than 2% the cost of the overall house. This question is, can this affect engineering standards set forth by Arvada? When I put this document together that was included in the packet, I had yet had a chance to talk with some folks from primarily utilities. And I had that meeting last Friday. And they did have a few concerns. Some of them I was able to provide some information as to it ultimately not affecting the overall water system. One concern was additional tap fees based on the potential for the residential supply tap having to go from 5/8 inch to 3/4 or maybe even 1 inch. But in talking with some folks from utilities, the single family tap fee is irregardless of size, according to the 2020 fee schedule. The one challenge as far as unanticipated costs that go with billing would be the fees that Metro Wastewater apply, and they do that based on domestic water tap sizes. And unfortunately, I haven't had enough time to look into that, and that would be quite honestly better answered by utilities. And I did ask Sharon Israel for some additional information on that, and I have yet to receive that. A couple other concerns that they had. They talked about with residential sprinklers, it allowing a longer spacing, a greater distance in between hydrants, going from 400 to 600 and 600 to 1,000 feet. One concern that they had, the way that the city operates right now in the utilities division is they use fire hydrants to flush the system. And their concern is having a greater spacing gives them less of an ability to turn that water over. There are other options out there. You know, it would be more of a decision for utilities to require the water blow-offs rather than utilize the hydrants. Those were pretty much the concerns that I got from utilities. The other one we talked about was backflows. Per the American Waterworks Association, they do state that backflow prevention would not be required if it has a multi-purpose system that's off of the domestic plumbing, or the residential sprinkler system tapped off of the domestic line inside of the house, with passive purge going to the most remote toilet to keep that water turning over. Again, that would have to involve a little bit more discussion with utilities as far as if they would allow that, but the American Waterworks Association does say that per their requirements, it is allowed to do that without a backflow. So with that being said, the only situation that would require a backflow is if there's a standalone fire line running parallel to the domestic water, to where it's purely a standalone system. So that's what I got from the utilities division at the city, which pretty much answers the next question of how is domestic water system protected from stagnant water. And then the next question was, have you received any information from Westminster Superior regarding their experiences? I had a fairly lengthy discussion with the chief building official from Westminster, and basically what he said is, you know, some of the biggest changes they've seen is just the domestic water line increase in size from the 5/8 to 3/4 and 1 inch. They have recently changed their standards to allow passive purge, and they are no longer requiring backflow preventers as long as they're tapped off the domestic water and having that passive purge. When it was originally implemented, the city of Westminster had a growth management program. So there's a limited number of rooftops that could go up at the time. And they said even at that time period and now, they haven't seen any developments go out of the city because of that sprinkler requirement. Some of the developers told them that these systems are costing approximately $12 a square foot. These weren't actual costs. They were quoted costs for the most expensive type of system, which is copper piping and tank and pump system. I got some data from the fire department. They have it from late 2013 through 2017, ranging from $1 to $3 a square foot and averaging out to $1.75. And one of the biggest things they have not experienced are any delays in the construction process. They have seen primarily the 13D systems as opposed to the multi-purpose systems. And in his overall assessment, the building department specifically, he wasn't speaking to utilities or anything like that, have been very minimally impacted by that requirement. One thing to note, if you guys don't know, Sharon Israel, who's the utilities director, she came from the city of Westminster, so she does have background and experience in this. I reached out to Superior. I'd never got a return call from them, but I did talk to the fire department, and apparently that decision in Superior was a city council driven decision. In fact, they actually didn't even talk to the fire department. They just went ahead and did it. And then Golden, the biggest difference that we'll see here as opposed to Golden is they're largely infill. You know, they have a house here, a house there. They don't have larger developments going in. So that the correlation between those two cities is pretty minimal. But they haven't seen any home builders or homeowners not want to build within the city of Golden because of that requirement. And they say that most of their systems are P2904, the 13D systems tapped off of the domestic water. And it's about a 50-50 split between those. The next question was, is in your review, you did not share where the fire started in the homes where people have lost lives. So I'll go through a couple of them. The first one that occurred in 2016 in the residential setting was on an exterior porch that extended into the house. The one in 2018 had started in the basement. But overall, the most common area of the home where fires start nationwide is within the kitchen. I don't know how many of you know, but we've spent the better part of 30 hours over the last 2 days investigating a fire. We had, unfortunately, 2 people lose their lives early Wednesday morning due to a fire in a residential structure. That one started in a bedroom and extended throughout the house. And the 2 people that unfortunately passed away, they were within 10 feet of the front door. And I can't stress enough, the reason for these 13D or any residential sprinkler system is to allow people the additional time to get out. When people are dying in homes, it's not from them getting burnt, it's inhaling the smoke. And what that sprinkler system does is it reduces the size of the fire, therefore not as much smoke being produced, and they have additional time to get out of the house. The next question is, are there any other factors involved that contributed to the lost life? And based on the fires that we have had here, it has been primarily people that are physically disabled, mentally, I guess I put in here cognitive deficits, which don't necessarily mean a disability. And one child, and this has lost their life as well. So it's primarily what we consider to be, the population that's most vulnerable, the young and the old. And one important statistic here, or 2 actually, is 54% of people who lose their life in a fire are age 55 and older. And the other one is only 19% of the fires in homes occur after 11 p.m. So between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., but 52% of the deaths. And that is primarily contributed to people sleeping. The next question is, are there any other options other than full house sprinkler systems? I don't know of any. This is purely the only type of intervention that we can put in a house proactively to reduce the spread of fire. The only other option is for the fire department to intervene and put the fire out.
Let me stop you for a second on that one.
Sure.
A while back, the Arvada Fire Department had a fire suppression system that you attached to your hood on your stove. And they were handed out for free to a lot of the homeowners. Has there been any development in that area at all?
They do have residential kitchen hood suppression systems. The most common one out there is called a Guardian suppression system. I don't have a cost on those. I know those are relatively inexpensive in the grand scheme of things, but I don't see anybody optionally putting those in. As a matter of fact, we used to require those in any commercial occupancy that had a range in there, and we've since taken that out. But that particular program with the fire department must have taken place before I started working here in 2015, because we have not done that for over 5 years.
Thank you.
Yep. Let's see, I think we're getting close to the end here. Response times could also be a factor in requiring sprinkler systems, primarily for homes in fringe areas. Yes, that is a true statement, but being the size of not only our district, but just the city of Arvada in particular, if we have a crew that, let's take any one of our stations and a fire occurs right next door, it all is predicated upon whether they're in quarters and available. We're running greater than 16,000 calls a year. That all of those factors, if they're out doing a community event or they're on another call play into the response time factors. So the variables with that are exponentially high, and we can't really, I don't really use that as a reason to not install sprinklers. Consideration for economic impact should include first-time homebuyers in the housing market. I agree. Obviously, I was one of those a while back, but overall, the cost of the system, like I said previously, is less than 2% of the overall cost of the house.
Thank you.
Builders that offer automatic sprinkler systems as an option, how many have they sold and at what cost to the owner? Is there a cost benefit to the homeowner adequate to decide to put sprinkler systems in homes? We contacted numerous current home builders within the city, and Richmond, William Lyon, Meritage, and Century specifically said they do not allow those as an option. Last year I built a house, William Lyon was my builder, and I asked them if I could install one throughout the construction process, and they said, you can do whatever you want when you own the building. And those specific ones do not provide that as an option. If they do provide it as an option, I think part of the challenge there is just the education, the public education on the benefits of these sprinkler systems, and that the cost they may have to put forward on the front end or throughout whatever the term of the loan is, it would significantly benefit them if there was a fire within their house. And the trade-off would be, you know, the cost of a sprinkler system, whether it be $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, is still less than our average fire loss on a single family structure fire. And then the last question was to provide adequate housing, which will require more apartments and townhouses to meet the buyer's needs. How can this change the dynamics of the city overall? So apartments already require it. Anytime you have a residential structure with more than 2 units is going to require a sprinkler system. Townhomes being the exception, you can have multiple townhomes attached as long as there's that 2-hour firewall there. I can't specifically talk to any impacts that the police, schools, or parks would have. Streets, there could be some benefits of less, I guess, overall width of roads to maintain. But I can't really speak to how that would change the dynamics of those divisions specifically. So that's an overview of the questions that I received. Does anybody have any else that you'd like me to answer?
Well, I want to thank you for your research. I have just a couple of questions. On the homes where people lost their life, even the most recent one just on Wednesday, were there smoke alarms and stuff installed in the house, and were they operational?
Let's see. So the first one in 2016, that one's a little bit of a different situation because it used to be considered a commercial occupancy. So they once had a fire alarm system within that building. And then when they decided to go, based on the number of people they were caring for, they went from a licensed to a non-licensed facility. And that no longer required a fire alarm, but they did have smoke alarms in there. I think there might have been 1 or 2 operational, but not all of them were operational. The one that occurred in 2018, again, had 1 smoke alarm, which I didn't look back into the older residential codes to see where smoke alarms were required, but that's typically what we see in a lot of older homes, the 60s, 70s era. That one was operational. And then the one that we had yesterday morning had 1 smoke alarm. It was not operational. And we do see that quite a bit. We do go out in the community somewhat often and install smoke alarms for free. But that's only one piece of the puzzle, the smoke alarms. That lets you know something happens, but it doesn't give you that additional time to get out like sprinkler systems do.
I understand what you're saying. It's just that sometimes we do these things and look forward, but are we doing the right things with what we have now before we add more layers to it?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. Unfortunately, the fire department through the fire code really has no ability to get in and require that within all the residential homes. We can provide the education, provide opportunities when we go out, and we call them smoke alarm blitzes. But that's pretty much the extent of what we can do for smoke alarms.
Well, if I could be mistaken, but I think smoke alarms are required in all new construction. They're linked and power backup and so on. And I think they're in the bedrooms and the main living areas as well.
That's correct. It's one on every floor, one outside of every sleeping area, and one inside of every sleeping area.
Okay. And I want to appreciate what you're doing, but I also spoke with Westminster and I learned a few details that were kind of impressionable on me. First of all, they found no decrease in building permits at all. They said they received some pushback initially, but after the first 2 or 3 years, they were receiving no pushback at all from HBA or any of the residential builders. So that's one part of the coin. The other thing they said is in regards to low-income housing, they said the committees and stuff that work on that and within their city have had no pushback to City of Westminster Building Department or the city at all. That has been a non-factor. The other thing he said was, I asked the question, how many lives were saved or fires did you have in any of these homes? 8 years, 0, none.
Zero fires or 0 saves.
Yeah, a lot of that I think is because of the more current building codes work stronger, whether we talk about the smoke alarms or what have you. We improve things consistently, and I think that's one of the factors. So those are the comments that I got from Westminster. I asked a bunch more things, but you pretty much covered them in your conversation as well.
Yeah, and one thing to tack on to the information that you got, that either there was no fires or no sprinkler activations, and building codes getting more modern and protecting the structures themselves. There's two parts to that I like to talk to people about. One being the contents. We can control how houses are built. We can't control what people put in them and how they interact with them, because the human element of fire is something that will never be solved. We won't be able to figure out a solution to that. The other is 30 years ago, we had the most current building codes at that time, thinking they were the best. And now those are the houses that are burning down. So it's not necessarily looking in the immediate future of 1, 2, 3, 5 years down the line. I'm looking for 30 years down the line when, for example, Candelas or Leiden is now an older community.
I understand that. I understand your position on it. And I'm conflicted. I happen to think it's the right thing to do, but I also don't know if it's the thing to do to mandate it, that it has to be done. That's where my conflict personally comes from. Have we done everything we can do without taking this step? And that's I guess that's the crux of where I stand today. And I don't really have a firm opinion whether yes or no. It's still, for me, it's a matter of still fact finding and trying to figure out where the best position is.
Sure, and I appreciate that.
Stephen, can you hear me?
I can.
I had a question as to where you get your cost figures when you come up with the 1.7% or whatever you said it was for a house. And because my experience since I just bought a new house is that everything is phenomenally expensive.
Sure.
And when you start getting to talk about the profit and those types of things that the builders are looking for, they try to pay that, and it ends up being quite a bit more expensive than for a $2,000 house, or 2,000 square foot house. I think we're talking more in the $30,000 to $40,000 range, rather than just a 1.7%.
Okay, yeah, so I based that 1.7% off of the systems that have been submitted and reviewed by us probably within the last 6 months. We don't have a large inventory of houses being sprinklered. Like I mentioned at the last meeting, they're all in unincorporated Jefferson County. But we have 6 in unincorporated that what we did is we took the actual cost of the system and compared it to the actual sale price of the house. And that's where I derived that 1.7%. And the most expensive sprinkler system that's going in right now is over just northwest of Arvada High School off of Balsam. And that is within the city. That one had to be sprinklered due to the significant setback off of the right-of-way. And that was a $20,000 system. And I found that out week before last when I was out there. And my initial thought was, wow, that's a lot more than what we've seen recently. But when you look at the sale price of the house, it was just over $1 million. So that one was, I think, 1.8%, 1.9% the cost of the house for the most expensive system we've seen.
Well, I do appreciate all your research. I know that there's a lot of work that goes into this, and so I'm going to continue to look into and see what more I can find on the thing. I don't think it's the right time to add it yet in this particular code go around, but I do think it's something to definitely keep on your thought and keep working at.
Well, there's one thing I'd like to clarify is, I'm not asking to add this. I'm asking to maintain it within the residential code. It's not something that's a fire department initiative to get that amended into the code. It's already prescriptive.
Yeah, we've been amending it out.
I also want to, and I've had some personal experience with this. When you ask builders to do things that's against their grain, and this would be one of those items, they oftentimes inflate the pricing significantly to make a point. First of all, the customer can expect to do it because it's too expensive as an option, or it's raised the house price an extra $10,000 or $20,000, and it has an impact on whether or not the potential buyer can buy it. And I've personally experienced that from trying to sell builders things that weren't required. In this case, it was weatherization barriers. But something that would cost a builder maybe anywhere from $300 to $1,000, they were charging anywhere from $6,000 to $8,000 to the customers if they required it. So I appreciate where you're coming from, and I understand the hurdles we have to go over and experienced it personally. But I'm on the line. I can't say yes. I can't say no.
So Steve, looks like you've done your homework. I've got some questions for you. Looks like you've been busy in the last couple of weeks.
We have, yeah.
So based on what you said for average cost, about $1.75 a square foot, and I just looked at some average numbers, about 2,800 square foot average size home in Arvada, equivalent to about $4,900. I did look at some other areas online, including Denver, which was about $229. Front Range, which came in at $1.59, so the $1.75 seems reasonable with what's out there. A big question I had was on remodels and change of usage. That's where we got stuck with this last time. I think it was like 12 years ago, because of the remodel cost, which it shows is closer to wide variance between $3 to $7 a square foot, which is pretty costly. How would this account for, maybe everybody can help me with this too. If you have an existing, so we're looking at existing building code, that we have a structure now, we're doing a change of use.
Yes.
So we're changing, so think of ADUs, because you know, the city council is very favorable now to converting garages, converting basements.
Yeah,
can
so
take that one.
okay, yeah, I was gonna pass it to you.
Well, so an ADU in a house is still a duplex, so that still falls under the same residential code. I don't
Right.
think we would take an existing space that gets split into an ADU and make it sprinklered, because this does not apply to this applies to new construction only. So you could conceivably add an ADU in your basement, or however that works, in your existing house and make it work without any sprinkler system.
So that
If
makes
you were-
sense, yeah.
If you were going to add a new unit
Hmm.
next to your existing house, I guess we'd have to talk about that. I mean, if it's another house on the same lot, you know, you build a new house, conceivably it's a house on the same lot, but it's completely new and separate.
Yeah.
Conceivably, that would need to be sprinklered. It wouldn't affect the existing house.
Hmm.
You'd be better off attaching it in that case, because additions do not need sprinklers in this code the way it's adopted.
Okay.
And then change of use in other ways, such as from a residential to a commercial occupancy. To be perfectly honest with you, since most houses are small, if they were converted into anything that we would commonly see, like an office building, that's the typical thing, some
Yeah.
other small buildings, that building as a commercial building would not need a sprinkler. So, because people don't sleep there, you know,
Right.
so an office building that's 4,000 square feet, which would be a big house, would not require a sprinkler system. So that conversion would not, there would be no effect there either.
Okay. Pretty much what my thoughts. So that's, thank you, Brita. But a big question that you didn't address, Steve, is if sprinklers were required in new construction, have you looked into what kind of operating cost savings we might have for the fire department over time? Maybe to help avoid tax increases. Did you guys look at that at all, or?
You know, I haven't. You know, it's probably something I should have looked into prior to our discussion tonight. Anecdotally, I can say there will be, you know, somewhat of a cost savings, you know, from
Mhm.
less wear and tear on the large apparatus. If they're not having to go more often than they're actually needed, you know, like I gave the example at the last meeting, you know, we're sending 4 engines, a truck, 2 ambulances, battalion chief, a fire investigator, a public information officer, actually 2 battalion chiefs. So we've got a large number of vehicles on the road going to this fire, where if it was sprinklered, we would most likely be sending an engine, an ambulance, and probably a battalion chief. So less, probably about a quarter the amount of apparatus to an incident that has a sprinklered structure.
And about how many fires did we have last year? Do you have those numbers, or the year before?
You know, we average, you know, we have different types of fire. Let me put it that way.
Right, residential.
So we run into about 100. I'd have to look at my data again, but we're. Let me pull that up, and I can tell you.
Okay.
Specifically, and I believe it is in this document, and I can look that up and chime in towards the end with that specific number, so I don't
Sure. And then,
monopolize the time with this.
did you get a chance? Did anybody get back to you from the chamber? I know things are kind of tough with
Yeah, I
COVID
forgot
thing.
to mention that. I reached out to, is it Kari? Is that her name?
Cami Welch?
Yep. And timing was somewhat unfortunate. She was heading out for, I think, 2 weeks on a vacation.
Yeah, she did go on vacation.
But she did ask the question of what is the impact on the business community, because that's their primary
Yes.
focus.
Yes.
And the only thing that I can come up with on an impact to the business community would be a developer or a builder based out of Arvada.
Yeah.
And that's what I told her, and she didn't seem like it was really needed to talk, and I have not heard back from her.
Okay, okay. I mean, we do have a government affairs committee that a lot of times looks at this stuff in more detail to kind of make it easier for everybody. And then that gives me a question for Brita. Either way, let's assume that we all agree on whatever adoption here of the 2018 amendments to the code. And let's say we agree to adding a requirement for fire sprinklers, or keeping it in the code, let's put it that way, or we agree to continue to exclude it for now. Is this something that's pretty easily taken up by council to add later on once there's more information to maybe help get more people on board?
Well, I wouldn't call it easy. I mean, so this, the code adoption process goes through a typical journey, which is meeting with you as the advisory board, where you recommend to council what you think is appropriate based on your technical expertise, and, look at this in a technical capacity. And then, typically for this code change, we're going to go to council 3 times, 3 different meetings, one for a workshop where we explain a lot of this stuff in detail, and then the first reading is more formality, and then the public hearing. And we typically don't do it, but every 3 to 6 years has been kind of the standard. So to do that all again it's certainly doable. We can add amendments if we need them. It's not what I would call simple. It's certainly doable. It's not simple.
Would it be like anything else they take up though? It has that same process, but because it may not be as consumptive, they may put that through with other bills. I mean, if let's say the consensus is not to do this now, I mean, I would just hate to see this topic die and have to wait 6 years. She's saying it may not be that easy. It is possible.
Well, certainly a single ordinance amendment, like on one small topic, is certainly easier to go through, but it's still, because it's an ordinance amendment, it has to go through all of the steps to become law. So it has to go through all of those formalities. Maybe not, a lengthy board meeting or 2, maybe not even a workshop, but it certainly has to go through the public hearing process with council.
Sure, gotcha.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, and then the very last part of that, let's say, I mean, council, we go through the workshop and they agree with our consensus, but there's some items that they don't like. Would they then kick that back to us for another meeting, or would they just make those changes? What do you think would happen?
They can choose to do a lot of different things. They can continue it for additional debate. They can make amendments right at the meeting itself. They don't typically do either of those unless it's a really big or contentious issue, and I wouldn't consider this either of those because it's pretty standard. Like
trash hauling.
Well, yeah, like trash hauling. Dirty words. You can't say that. They typically would not do either of those things. They would probably make a decision. They could take up something and tweak it as an amendment to the ordinance when they make their motions. They don't do that a lot, but they could do that. That would probably be the most typical thing. If you guys recommended it and that's what you're going to put forward to them and they said no, they would basically stop and probably take care of that right during the meeting and make an amendment to the proposal. So that would be my guess as to how they would take care of it.
Okay. Thank you.
We haven't heard how you feel about this. The fire sprinkler systems. Do you have any opinion on that yourself? Did you hear me?
You talking to me?
Bretta, do you have any?
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Do you have any opinions on it from, not personally now, I'm talking about strictly from the city and from the code offices there, the building offices?
Yeah, well, it's, I understand why it's a good thing to do. I understand the importance of it for protecting life. And of course, kind of the base of what we all kind of are ingrained with is life safety is the thing. That's why we do this job. We're not doing it to pick out beautiful light fixtures, and it's not really why we're in this business. So it is something that, listen, when I got the information that we had that fire on Wednesday, I literally was I felt sick, and I felt sick most of the day. And, you know, I have, in a very, very remote capacity, seen all of these fires that Stephen has talked about, and I wasn't there and I didn't respond. But you just think about things that if you would have had more foresight back in the day, what could have been done. It makes you kind of not really worry so much about the money part of it. Now, the reality of it is that money always plays a role. And so, you know, there's a lot of other factors that drive these decisions. And so I always feel kind of torn about it. I mean, I wish people would recognize the value of these things and choose them before choosing, you know, the marble foyer. You know what I mean? I wish people would choose these things before choosing some other things that they choose when they buy a new house. They don't always do that. Part of it is the general public doesn't understand it. So sometimes you have to choose for them and sort of, you know, work with that because you think it's the best thing to do. It's a very difficult thing for me because I do feel very torn about it, but, you know, specifically this week talking about it is really hard because of the fire that happened. And, you know, I still feel a little shaken up by it. So
I agree, and it's always a tragedy, but at the same time, just with the basic information, they had smoke alarms that weren't in operation. There's probably some other factors involved that we haven't heard yet. And I saw a cartoon that came up and said, take caution labels off of everything and we will eliminate stupid very quickly. At what point can we expect people to take some responsibility for themselves, like changing a battery in a smoke alarm? I mean, we talk about it, the news people talk about it twice a year, you know, you do it automatically, but evidently there are many people that are not doing it. So at what point do you say, yes, it's a tragedy, but unfortunately, there's certain steps they could have done to prevent the tragedy as well.
yeah. And I think about, you know, if you have a sprinkler system, you don't have to change the battery, you know, it's done for you. You don't have to think about it. So you could debate both sides of it over and over. And
I know, and that's why I'm probably in your position. I sit on the fence. I don't know whether yes or no. I feel I'm torn both directions.
You know what's interesting is this is something that I was against 12 years ago because of the way it was presented to us. But as I look at this, I'm looking at the reliability of these systems, and it's between 81.3 to 99.5% based on various studies. But the interesting thing is that the average reduction in loss of life is 84%, regardless of the reliability. And I'm one of those that's always conservative with saving costs, except for we really need to do something. Like when I look at changes, like say on the roofing side of the code, what's actually going to reduce costs to property owners to save them from dealing with issues? Well, in this case, we're talking about lives. And I mean, personally, it's something that I would definitely support personally. And, you know, we have to weigh that, what responsibility do we have to our taxpayers, our citizens, and our builders and businesses to keep costs down at the same time. You know, we're looking out for the health, safety, and welfare, are supposed to be. That's the whole purpose of the building department and code. That's what was originally started and promoted by insurance for that reason. So it's a tough thing, regardless of how this comes out. I mean, I'm kind of sliding off the fence here because I'm personally in favor of it.
So am I, actually. As a design professional, that's life safety is our #1 job, whether the public realizes it or not. And this, to me, is a life safety issue, and it should be in the code as a minimum.
So I initially thought my opinions on the matter were going to be a little bit bold tonight, but it doesn't sound like it. I am also one to come down on the side of life safety. And were it up to me, I would prefer to see that it not be amended out of the code.
So
on the opposite side, I would prefer to amend it out because I think that most fires or most deaths are caused by the smoke. And if we could work on getting the smoke detectors to actually be done better, or, you know, provide them plentifully somehow a better program for getting them to go. I think we could save more lives than requiring an IRC inclusion.
Jim, you're right. The smoke is the issue, but as Steven said, if you have the sprinklers, you're decreasing the fire time, which is decreasing the smoke issue, right? So
Correct.
the smoke has to reach the smoke alarm before it actually goes off. Whereas I believe the sprinkler would actually activate sooner than the smoke alarm. I could be wrong.
It depends on the situation, but you know, some of the tests that we've done and some national organizations, the smoke alarms are very responsive. And in the side-by-side demonstration that we did at our safety day last year, the smoke alarm does go off first, but it's
Should.
all a matter of your response time to that. You know, because how many times are you laying in bed in the middle of the night and you hear it go off? How long does it take you to get up and go figure out what's going on? And once you figure out what's going on, if there actually is a fire, you have that much less time to get out of the building. National statistics say you have, with not modern construction, but modern materials that we're putting in the building, less than 2 minutes to get out of your house. So I know in the middle of the night, just hearing it, trying to wake up and figure out what the heck's going on, and then walking the house, you're already down 60 to 90 seconds at least. So your chance of survival for you, if you're up, but then if you have other family members in there, you're not going to just walk out of the house. You're going to go back in and let your wife or your husband or your kids or whoever's staying at the house with you, you're going to go back in there. So you're going to be in there much longer than the time where the house is tenable in a fire situation. And these systems really should go hand in hand. You know, smoke alarms are notification. They're letting you know that something's going on. And the sprinkler system is the part that suppresses the fire or controls it. So I'm not of the mindset personally that either of these individually would solve the problem. I think it has to be a culmination of both types of systems in order to truly be effective and get the best result.
I would also ask the question about Denver, Lakewood, and you know, Douglas County, some of the other large areas that have not adopted it, and I question why they haven't.
I can't speak to that. I didn't reach out to them. I can assume with the best of them. I'm not going to, because I don't want to speak for anybody. But I did bring this up with the city of Wheat Ridge last year when we adopted the 2018 code that went into effect 2 weeks ago. They decided not to include it. And there was very little discussion. The Building Code Advisory Board in Wheat Ridge actually supported it and pushed it through. But the city council did not, and there was no discussion on the matter. So I don't know what their reasoning was to vote against it.
I'm not sure where we go from here. I guess the question is there's 4 of us on here that would vote, and if it's a split decision, where does that go?
Well, so you need a majority of the board to basically make a motion for recommendation. So you're not making a decision whether this gets adopted or not. All you're doing is advising council. And so, but the majority vote rules still apply. So I think I got that right, Emily. Tell me if I'm wrong.
You are correct. And if it, you know, we can also always tell council that it was a split vote, depending on, they may be interested in how the discussion, you know, occurred here and what the leanings were, but based on what we officially recommend is based on majority.
Where do we go next?
Well, so I would recommend that since we're going through it kind of in an orderly fashion, if you want to make a recommendation and vote on it based on this topic specifically for these two items that are shown on the screen. One of them is townhomes. One of them is 1 and 2 family dwellings. Essentially, the amendment that we have works. The removal of it simply is striking it from this document. So it's real straightforward for me to do, but that would be either you support the code as written or you support the code as amended. And then vote, essentially.
Is there anyone at this point interested in making a motion with regard to either the townhomes or the 1 and 2 family dwelling?
Can we separate the two?
You certainly could if you chose to.
Are you going to make a motion on just the fire sprinklers or the whole adoption?
Just on the fire sprinklers, I think. I mean, just this topic in particular, I think.
So I think when you go to make your motion, you can do amendments, and Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can make an amendment to the motion, because how we have written the motion is that you're going to approve the approval to city council, and then you would make an amendment and then vote on the amendment and then vote on the full recommendation.
That would
That's
also be fine, yeah.
We don't have a motion yet, do we?
No, it would be toward the end when you go to actually do the whole ordinance.
Got you. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
you would.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Shara, would you like me to move on? Is that what you'd like me to do?
Yes, let's move forward with the remainder of the discussion.
Okay. So
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for doing all that work.
So the majority of the discussion that we have left, and I may have already flipped by the IBC section. We can go back to that, but I think we were all actually quite. I take that back. I'll just mention one thing. So it's somewhat connected to this topic, but we've had an amendment in this in the IRC for quite some time that requires an additional smoke detector in unfinished or in rooms and basements that are 100 square feet or more in size. So like typically they're a furnace room or a storage room, but we've had that in the code for a long time. It was in addition to what the code actually states, which is 1 on every floor, a smoke detector, 1 outside of each sleeping area, 1 in each bedroom. And now with the code, the way it's written, we have underfloor protection requirements so that we have either a drywall ceiling, which adds fire protection. We have in alternate from that, it could be a solid sawn lumber, or it could be something protected with the fireproofing material. And so staff is recommending that we actually delete that amendment because they feel it's somewhat outdated and redundant at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to find where that is. I don't think we talked about that last time. Maybe I'm mistaken. I don't know if anybody needs some additional information on that, or if you have any thoughts or comments on that.
This would be like a basement or a space that's not used, not currently in use.
Here it is right
I think
here.
it's like a storage.
Not a finished living space, or is it just storage? Not used or non-finished?
It's a storage room over 100 square feet.
Storage, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Unfinished. And
Unfinished?
separated. Yeah, unfinished and separated out. So most of the time it is a storage room. It could be an unfinished furnace room.
Gotcha. So unfinished, that could also be basement though, right? If it's separated.
But the basement will
part?
will have a smoke detector if it's completely unfinished, so it will meet that requirement.
I mean, like if you have a basement that's half finished and then you have an unfinished portion.
Yes, you would have 1 in the finished portion and 1 in the unfinished portion.
Good, okay.
Correct.
And I think staff has said that they would just like to go back to what the code actually says and delete this amendment.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's fine, Brett. I don't see a problem.
Do we need a motion to do that? or just
I
make that change?
Don't believe we would need a motion. It's already in the document as presented, so it would just be included when a recommendation is made at the time of the vote.
Good, okay.
Correct.
Yeah, I think you would probably just say accept staff amendments and corrections and then make an actual motion or include in the motion about the sprinkler systems. I think that needs to be spelled out.
Okay.
Okay, let's see here. Sorry, this document is a little bit unwieldy, so it takes me a little bit to scroll through. So I think the next, honestly, the remainder of the comments relate to roofing, and Dan has sent a fairly significant amount of information that was in your packet. It's toward the end. I think Dan is proposing a few different items, one of them being some sort of amendment to deal with vapor barriers in flat roof type situations to prevent moisture condensation. And this would be in the commercial segment, and it would also be an amendment to the energy code. And then additional discussion about ice and water shield. And Dan, you'll have to add to that if I'm missing something.
Yeah, I've got, and we can start wherever you want, but so we're looking at the geographic and climate design criteria for ice barrier, that's one. Adding a subsection to the code requires ice barrier into valleys, which is already common usage, common practice, but not always followed. And then the amendment that was, and then some of this has to do with the amendments that are already there. So I don't know if you want me to just highlight these and then we can discuss them. But item 3 was on the amendment for elevated battens. The way it's actually written doesn't actually cover the way they're actually installed today. The next one was flashing around the openings, which we talked about before. I think the solution to that was to leave it as it is because the code already covers that, and we can talk about that in more detail. Number 5 was about the basic wind speed that we discussed. I think I came up with a solution with that actually solves the issue. But we did talk about changing the ultimate wind speed, which would have a change to that. And then you mentioned the vapor barriers, which I think was in my previous email that I sent. So there's actually a total of 6 items. Other stuff we kind of left for, stuff to be dealt with in regular handouts. These are things that are actually code related. So if we want to start with just the first one, I guess take them in the order that they're written in the code. If you want to do it that way, go by section, or how do you want to go about it?
Yeah, that's fine. I just need to direct us to, I'm trying to flip between your information and the actual ordinance itself. I think, Cheryl, how would you recommend doing this, Cheryl? I mean, do we want to have a general discussion about the topics? Oh, you're muted.
Let's start with unmuting myself. Is there general discussion with regard to the topic? Does anybody see a need to go through it item by item and discuss it?
Well, I think we want to look at these and decide whether we want to change them item by item, so that I think will be beneficial because there may be some we agree on and some that we don't.
I think I found a place where we can pretty easily go through them item by item if you want to. It's in actually the email that Dan sent. I may be able to pull up 2 documents here. What do you guys want to do as the board collectively?
I would like just to see what the wording is you're going to change for the specifics of each code issue. And I think that we all understand some of the dynamics of why we're changing them. Dan's done a good job of informing us of that.
So Dan, can you see the screen?
Yeah.
So am I at the right spot here? This is suggested change in blue, the first one?
Right, it is, yes.
Okay. So Dan's proposing that we either make no change to, or modify the language as follows. I think we talked about this at the last meeting, which is to specify more specifically, which is the wrong language to use, how to flash around skylights, evaporative coolers, and so on. I personally think it's not necessary to have an amendment here. I think some of this has to do with workmanship, and the code is vague enough to cover proper flashing of these things personally.
And my thought on that, Brita, was it could always be part of a handout if it's a problem to just help point it out to contractors.
And I think that would be absolutely fine as a solution. Anyone else have any kind of feedback, thoughts on that?
I guess my question would be are we seeing this as an existing problem that we're trying to solve? Or is it thoughtful recommendation?
I think that's on your end, Brita, because it was already in the document.
I think it relates to people's knowledge and workmanship as far as contractors who are experienced with things and can think on their feet, because there's a lot of different situations you run into in the real world as far as slope and how things are configured. And so I think the concept is covered. I don't think it, and I think that the inspectors understanding generally how flashing should work and contractors being informed about it is already covered in the code. So it is more of a experience level, knowledge base issue that we can handle through giving a handout or something like that. I don't think we need to actually do an amendment.
Then I would agree with a handout versus making a revision.
I also like that idea. Educating the contractor of what he's actually doing is a positive move.
So Dan, is this number 2, the ice barrier underlayment at valleys, the second item? Did I miss something? Or do we want to go back up?
Yeah, I know I had sent you 2 different emails with this order, but this one's fine. So ice barrier underlayment, we're talking about 2 different sections here, 2 different parts of the code. One is going to be, I'm referencing the actual code area. If we go back up just a little bit. Go
Sorry.
back, yeah, or says it eaves. Okay, now it goes down. It just kind of jumped. Okay, there, is it there? Nope, down a little bit.
Down?
I don't know if we're just not, yeah. It's past the flashings.
Here's
there we
eaves
go. There we
and
go.
valleys.
There we go. There we go. There we go. Right there. Right there. So what we're looking at is this would be a designation under table R301.21, which is our geographic and climatic design criteria. Same place where we talk about the wind speed requirement. So I'm citing section 1507.282 on ice barrier, which you run into a lot, where it states in existing code, areas where there's been a history of ice forming along the eaves causing backup of water and ice barrier that consists of at least 2 layers of underlayment cemented together, blah, 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 shall be used. And that's we talk about ice barrier, typically ice and water shield. It's the same thing these days because that's what's typically used, not that you can't still make an ice barrier. So going to why we should use the ice barrier, it's based on experience. What have we experienced in Arvada? So I give examples of ice damming, show photos of actual ice damming that's occurred in Arvada in the last 10 years. And then we have a letter from the previous Colorado Roofing Association president and the current Colorado Roofing Association president, who just sent his like 3 or 4 days ago, recommending the use of ice barrier at the eaves for all jurisdictions in the Front Range and climate zones 5 and 6. There's two counties in Colorado that are climate zone 4. So recommending climate zones 5, 6, and 7, but the Front Range 5 and 6 would include Arvada. Reason being is the experience that as an industry we have with damage from ice buildup at the eaves and ice dams. Going to item 2, Jefferson County, which is in and around Arvada. requires use of ice barrier at all elevations. Code specifically states where the history of ice dams, ice barriers to be used. Vast majority of asphalt manufacturers, shingle manufacturers require the use of ice barrier at the eaves to extend 24 inches inside the worn wall. And then we also have a recommendation from Mark Graham, our technical director at the National Roofing Contractors Association, again for the use of ice barrier where there's a history of ice buildup. So I guess the issue we run into here is makes it pretty difficult to ignore that we do get ice buildup at the eaves. Is it on every home? No, but it doesn't say it has to be on every home. And the problem we run into is about every 3 years it gets pretty bad. That's when you're getting phone calls for a lot of different properties that get damaged. And I will agree that most of these are homes that don't already have ice and water. Where they have ice and water shield, we see very little damage because it does a good job on steep slope roofs of protecting the home. Your average roof, shingle roof, has over 8,500 fasteners in it. Those are nails. Those are actually penetrations through the roof. Ice and water shield, because of the way it constricts and adheres to the roof deck, does a very good job of helping to seal around that for the short periods of time we have ponding water in those areas at the eaves and valleys. That's where we see it. So with that, I mean, I already gave plenty of other information, but is there questions on that particular one? Ice barrier at the eaves?
No, we had talked a lot about it, and for those members that were on the board, we talked about a lot about this the last time we did the code adoption. So I don't have anything to add. So
yeah, I think last time we did get some pushback from home builders. I don't know if it's there as much anymore, but cost of ice barrier, since it's been more common, has come down, which is why it's now being used commonly in valleys and other areas on the roof, which is good. But our standpoint is that the cost is insignificant compared to the cost of the roof. It adds like 3%, so it's pretty small amount. Anybody?
My personal experience is I had a house out in Sunrise Ridge for over 20 years. I replaced the roof 3 times, each time with ice and water shield. And so it cost me several dollars over and what I would have normally had to pay. And I can only remember one time where I really had anything that even looked like ice damming. So I personally think it was not something that was necessary at that point. Maybe on some special roofs, or maybe in the eaves where you've got, I'm sorry, in the valleys, it might be a good idea there. But if you have proper drainage, I didn't have any issues at all.
and valley flashing is still required for open valleys, and so there's still an element of that in valleys. There's limitations on where you can put nails in a valley as well. So there is some built-in protection to the way the code is written and the manufacturer's instructions for that matter. So it would be an extra layer of protection in the valleys as well. So just so you know.
So typically at valleys, the ice and water shield, rather than being an extra layer protection, is used as the actual underlayment in place of. What's happened is Brady used to have a lot of 90-pound. What's happened over the years with value engineering is that 90 pounds no longer 90 pound. It's less than that. They've changed the designation, and then they've gone to these valley liners that are less than that. There's been a switch in the industry to especially in cold climates, the ice and water would actually be in place of that. So just be a requirement to use that at the valleys and also under metal valleys. Not that you couldn't use both.
Dan, I personally agree with you. You did it on my own home. But I still think it's a decision that the homeowner can make when he replaces a roof, and that a contractor could make. If he's having ice damming problems in his first couple of 3 years, he's going to be facing some warranty issues and some things on that side of things. And his insurance company is going to mandate certain procedures for him to eliminate those costs. So I'm not sure that we need the ice and water shield on the eave lines. The metal valleys, I happen to agree with you on.
So you touched on something there, Blake. The average life of a roof in the Colorado right now is 7.8 years. 10 years ago it was 15, almost 15.8. About half of that is due to the storm pattern. The vast majority of roofs in the Front Range, residential roofs, over 78%, get replaced from hail claims. The biggest issue we run into this with is when people do have problems, insurance does not require it unless it's in the code. And so they're not paying for it. Now, I agree with you, people should pay for it out of pocket. It's an understanding there. Now, the contractors also should be required to follow it. When you look at the code, it says area or areas. It does not say specifically geographic areas. So even on a roof, if you have certain areas that have ice damming, you should be using ice and water shield. The problem is that they don't. And we could, there's an alternative to this if you guys decide, against just requiring it, and that is to and again, this could be done in a handout, but it's just to state that if there's a history of ice buildup and ice damming on that particular property, then the use of ice barrier at the eaves is required. That kind of spells it out and takes care of it, and then it's only on those specific properties.
That's actually what our current handout says and what we tell people. So just so you know that.
Yeah.
It's if there's a history of ice damming, you need it.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm saying is we can address it, without having to make this change. But I'll be honest with everybody, this is something I really have to do as being a part of the Code and Standards Committee, is present this, and we have about half the municipalities right now that are, probably a little less than half, that are requiring it. And so there we are. Any more questions on that one, on the ice barrier at the eaves, or comments?
I think I'm satisfied with the handout.
Okay. And then at the valleys, if we scroll down just a little bit,
It's at the top now.
yeah. So we're talking about 1507991. Meadow Valley flashing underlayment shall be solidly cemented to the roofing underlayment for slopes in 7 units vertical to 12, or self-adhering polymerified bitumen sheet. That's a little bit, and because what they're talking about there is the fact that and steeper slope roofs, and it gets hot under Meadow Valleys, especially in the summertime, and there could be some slippage. And they're talking about making sure that that barrier is adhered. Well, ice and water shield takes care of that. The requirement for ice and water shield as a valley underlayment kind of solves that issue in all applications, which again, it's a common application now, required by manufacturers. It's just not quite commonly employed by all contractors. And if you're looking for a roof for a long-term warranty, they'll install the ice and water shield and still install your 90-pound and then your shingles, but it's more commonly just the ice and water shield and then the roof covering. And the good thing is there's really no cost difference. They cost pretty much about the same. So any questions on that one?
So they're already doing this? Because I think the manufacturer's instructions do require this. So adding an amendment is sort of redundant to the manufacturer's instructions. Am I understanding that right?
Some manufacturers do require it, and other manufacturers suggest it. So it's not a universal requirement. To be honest with you, we run into a bigger issue with ventilation, where it's kind of a circular definition. A lot of times the code says it's required, the manufacturer requires it on re-roofs, and then the manufacturer says it's required if the code requires it. So this isn't as big of an issue. Again, it's something I have to bring up, and we can decide to, include in our recommendations in the handout, since you already have the recommendation for or the requirement for ice and water shield at the eaves.
I'm trying to keep score here. Any general thoughts on this?
I still think we should be doing what the manufacturers require, which should be typically to have the ice and barrier underneath in the meadow valleys. But to require it, I don't think, I would support requiring it in that situation, yes.
One of the ways that can be handled is that we have certified installers that install to the manufacturer's recommendations and to report.
Yeah, that's our recommendation as association to all property owners.
So in terms of the ordinances that are written and licensing and so on, we require licensing, but there's nothing in our ordinance as it's written now that would require them to provide us a report or anything like that with a roofing installation. So we have our inspection process, depending on the type of roof it is, and that would be the verification that we have. So we would have to make modifications to do that.
That's a whole other issue. I mean, ideally it'd be nice, but that's something that's kind of difficult it's a very difficult decision to do something like that. But it's not a bad thing. Here's the thing, you don't have to actually be they have different levels of certification for most shingle manufacturers. You can get a certification without having to be certified to install their highest warranties. It just shows that you know how to install that particular product. So I don't think it's too far of a stretch to require that, but something that you guys decided on doing. But it's not something I'm proposing at this time.
Well, Dan, I think we ought to leave it the way it reads, and I think that the building department, through code review and so on, can point some of those things out to the builder or the installer.
Yeah, if we don't support these changes, I guess, like I said, some of this stuff we can take care of with a handout as long as we address it. I think we're still covered as long as we're able to address it and enforce it. I think we're still covered.
Okay. So the other element, I think, so that covers like flashing, ice and water issues. Then the other element I think that you wanted to talk about was the energy efficient roofs. Am I missing something?
We had some pretty easy ones, and it was in the email from I think it was July 7th, Brita, or July 10th. It was an error that I found that I didn't see last time. And we could just go back to that section and I can explain if it makes it easier. Because I think we can get through these next couple pretty easily and maybe save us some time.
Is it in the energy code or is it in the IRC?
It's in the IRC, 905 3.7.
Oop, I almost had it.
You're real close to it.
I don't think we have a modification, so.
There actually was, let's see. I didn't put down the corresponding IBC section, but it's.
Sorry guys, my.
I can
for some
try
reason
to
my
find it real
screen
quick.
is squirrely. I keep going right. 9053. There we go. Application.
Yeah, you got it. 905.
I'm close.
Oh, you're right, almost there.
For some reason, my mouse wants to like skip over pages, so I apologize.
Oh, there you go.
Yep.
So, okay, here we go. It says vertical battens of a minimum of 3/8 inch thickness made of cedar or decay-resistant treated lumber. Decay-resistant are required in the horizontal battens. Now, 12 years ago, yes, this made perfect sense. Today, It doesn't, because that's not typically what's used. So what's typically used is elevated battens, and our only manufacturer in this region, which is Boral Tile, that bought Monair Tile about 6-7 years ago, makes some very good treated battens. So my suggestion for this is what I had sent you on the 10th, is that we replace this with vertical battens of a minimum 3/8 inch thickness made of cedar or decay-resistant treated wood, or other decay-resistant materials are required under the horizontal battens. Spacing depends on the size of the horizontal battens based on the total roof loads. And then add on to that, pre-manufactured elevated battens or discs may be used in place of vertical battens. So we're changing to NSSC manufacturer's specifications, just like you have on there. So we're adding pre-manufactured elevated battens or discs, may be used in place of vertical battens, to the end of your sentence there, right before see manufacturer specifications, to cover what's actually used today. And we're adding treated, let's see, we got treated wood. So we're just,
Well, can I ask you a question, Dan?
yes,
So these new products are listed and they're also specified by the manufacturers, right?
no, they're not. So what we're doing is we're not, by stating this, we're not allowing those products. So if we add that sentence, we're allowing those products which are more commonly used.
Well, and we always have the ability to accept an alternate material under Chapter 1. So I guess from the building official side of things, I would certainly say if there was a product out there that was industry standard that has come on the market since the code was written, it would be silly of me not to say, yes, absolutely, you can use it because the manufacturer specifies it's fine and here's the data.
Sure.
So I think we're covered.
My answer to that is, oh, why should you have to do that?
Well, because we do it all the time. The entire
Okay.
code the code doesn't cover every product available. I mean, there are literally thousands of things that we get requests to approve as an alternate.
Okay. So if you weren't here, somebody else could say the same thing, that, hey, yeah, you can use elevated battens because it performs the same function. That's what you're saying,
yes,
rather than,
exactly.
rather
That's
than
exactly
restrict
right.
them.
Correct.
On the other side, what I see too is that on the other side, you get the misrepresentation, because I get this. Oh, I have to install vertical battens on this roof. Well, no, you don't. And the issue is that most contractors don't have a engineer or designer involved, and so they're going to put in vertical battens on that roof, which actually puts it in worse condition than if they use the elevated battens or discs.
So it brings up another question, which is, do we even need this amendment? I mean, we have a lot of amendments that we're finding that are kind of, in some ways, redundant because
I think
they got so specific that it then hemmed us in. You know what I mean?
Well, that's my other suggestion. If you're not going to modify this amendment, take it out, because it's actually directing them in the wrong direction.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. I think maybe that's a better solution, is to actually get rid of it.
I would agree with that. Yeah. I would agree with that.
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
You can universally pretty much say that I'm a fan of less amendments. So.
Okay.
So is your attorney.
So is our attorney. Yes.
I mean, I would just propose to everybody, if we don't make the addition for the elevated battens and discs, that we just remove that amendment under R90537.
So
I would agree with the removal.
18-197.
Be okay with that.
I would also be in agreement with removing an amendment.
I love you. I know I love all you board members because I just do. Okay. I'm happy to do that. I mean, I think I'm in agreement. So not that my vote counts at all, but it just makes sense to me from the technical standpoint to do that. So
yeah, I think we're better off that way. And we only have two more, and I think this one's easy too. We had that discussion about basic wind speed that commonly gets confused, and I think I have a really easy solution for that one. That was 16093, a basic wind speed in
the IRC or by IBC.
That's your IBC 16093.
There it is right there.
Okay, so the problem we run into all the time is a difference between ultimate and basic wind speed. We're actually designing for basic wind speed. So when we specify V ultimate, there's a lot of confusion. So there's a simple way to solve that. We simply change this from the wind speeds for the city of Arvada are 136 V alt, and we say the wind speeds for the city of Arvada are 105 miles per hour, 105 mph, parentheses, 136 V alt. From the eastern city limit west to Highway 93, and the wind speeds for areas west of Highway 93 is 115 mph, parentheses, 150 V alt. Now we solve the problem that we constantly run into on this because we've covered it. There's a lot of confusion with conversion as to what the actual basic wind speeds are. This takes any question out of it, and this is a common problem.
Daniel, I'm kind of looking to you on this one a little bit.
So this is a structural section, and basic wind speed is ultimate wind speed. It's been changed, right? We don't have a basic wind speed anymore. We don't have a service wind speed anymore. So
Do we know why the roofing manufacturers and the structural engineers are looking at this differently? Is it the ASCE? Is it one that adopts ASCE and one doesn't? Is that kind of the deal?
well, the IBC adopts ASCE 7,
Right.
And ASCE 7 says the ultimate. So I'm not sure why the roofing industry is still at service. The window manufacturers are still at service too.
And there's always the ability to convert it back. I mean, when we first adopted the V Ultimate, we had to actually do a conversion. It's not like the code was fully, there wasn't an easy conversion. So when we adopted it, we had to do a conversion and adopt V Ultimate. Now it's a little more standard.
Mm-hmm.
But you can always convert it back using the same methodology. Is that fair to say?
It is. Yep. And
So
and I think if
adopting
you're
one doesn't exclude the other one. It just means that you're not saying what it is.
Well,
right,
exactly. So when you put these in here, so if you look at ASCE 7 and it publishes ultimate and design wind speed, all we're doing is clarifying both of those. So in other words, your 143 ultimate is 110 design wind speed. Your 143 ultimate is 110 design wind speed. And I deal with about a dozen structural engineers on a lot of these projects. Your design wind speed, 77.73% of your V ultimate, your ultimate wind design speed.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it hurts absolutely nobody to make this designation, but it solves issues, and we're recommending it across the board, to everybody statewide. Just designate both your basic and your V ultimate. Now there's no question whether you choose to design off the V ultimate or the basic wind speed. It takes all the questions out of it.
I think my dilemma with it is that the section title is basic wind speed. So if you have a title of basic wind speed, which refers you to a V ultimate, and then within the section you call something else basic wind speed, it confuses the issue. Well, because of the way the code is set up. Because in the other areas of the code, it talks about basic wind speed, and in the code books, they're referring to V ultimate only. And then for other manufacturers that want to revert back,
can we just give them a reference number, chart number such and such, or what have you?
Well, it's another thing. It seems like another thing for the roofing handout in my book. If the manufacturer is not specifying V ultimate, here's what it would be. It would be this. V ultimate converts to this, and that's what we would do in a handout. That seems to make more sense to me. Because this is specifically for roofing contractors. It's almost the entire rest of the code is built on the using V ultimate only is kind of my theory.
Mm-hmm. And that's correct. I mean, if you're gonna specify something other than V ultimate, it has to be V service, not V basic, right? Because the two designations in the code are ultimate and service.
Yeah, it's just V, and I mean in ASCE 7, it's just referred to as V. You have V and V ultimate, so you've got depending on what you're referring to. So we get this confusion a lot with manufacturers too.
Is it explained
Scares
in
me a little bit.
definitions?
What's that?
Is it explained in definitions at the beginning of the code? It talks about definitions and so on.
Oh, that's a good point, Blake. That's a good point. Let's look at that real quick. Let's see.
I don't think it is, but let me look.
Definitions.
No. Oh, wait, yes, it is. V, basic design wind speed. V, ultimate, allowable stress design wind speed.
Exactly what I'm saying. V is basic design wind speed. But the thing is you see what a problem is we have is we're saying basic. This has been a common issue, guys, and it's not. There's some things in the code that cause us some heartache just because of the way they're written. This is one of those because it makes this lack of understanding, like Daniel just brought up, that we're talking about basic design wind speed and we're getting everybody V ultimate.
But V ultimate is basic wind design speed, right?
No, it's not saying that. V is basic design wind speed. V ultimate is your ultimate wind speed, and we're looking at your difference between your 3-second burst and your sustained wind, basically.
V is your ultimate wind speed. It is based on a 700-year recurrence of a wind speed, whereas VASD is the basic wind speed that you're saying, right? So VASD of 136 is 105.
So when we look at wind speeds, we're looking at sustained wind and 3-second burst, right? So we're looking at sustained wind and your ultimate wind speed constantly. When we test shingles, when we test roof systems, membranes, we're looking at both of those. And the fallacy we have in this part of the code is we're stating basic wind speed and we're giving them V alt. Whereas your definition is pretty clear what V is. It's your basic design wind speed. V ultimate is your ultimate wind speed, which is going to be your 3-second burst. So it's what are we designing for?
In the 2010 ASCE 7, they changed from a 50-year recurrence interval to a 700-year recurrence interval, which increased your basic wind speed from 105 to 136. Right, so basic wind speed in the 2005 code was 105, and the basic wind speed in the 2010 ASCE 7 is 136. Right, so they didn't change the definition of basic wind speed, but they changed the statistics on which you calculate wind speed. So in order to get your 2005 wind speed, you have to call it an ASD wind speed.
Okay, I guess I'm still not seeing the difference between the definition between the basic and the ultimate. You're saying that they took the requirement on the calculation for V or for V ultimate?
For V. They changed V from V ASD to V ultimate. So in one code it was VASD, and in the next cycle they changed it to V ultimate. And it was because seismic loads were calculated at an ultimate level, and wind loads were calculated at an ASD level. So in order to compare the two, they wanted both to be calculated at an ultimate level. So they wanted them to have the same recurrence interval or a level of same recurrence. So everything is at a higher level. So to get back down to the wind speed that you want and that most shingle manufacturers, window manufacturers, cladding manufacturers want to design for, you have to actually take the calculated wind pressure based on the basic design wind speed and multiply it by a factor that the code gives you
to get your ultimate wind speed.
To get your ASD wind speed.
Okay.
It's going backwards. It's
going
back
backwards.
to the old.
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I get your ASD wind speed. Your
Right.
so your V ultimate is still your 3-second gust. So in other words,
It is.
115 mile an hour V ultimate is equivalent to a VASD of 91 miles per hour.
Correct.
But it's still the same thing. You're still designing for the 91 mile. You just said the VASD, right? The 91 mile per hour.
Right. Right.
Right. You're still, there's not any difference here. You're still designing for the same thing. And if I take
Right.
if
We
I
just
take 91 divided by 115, I get basically 79%, pretty close to the 78% we had before.
Right. Just in this section, you were saying you wanted to call it V basic, and we would have
No,
to call it.
that's not what I said. That's not what I said. What I said on that was, let me get back to it. We're trying to declare both because what you stated is commonly what we run into. And the fact is that we talk about ultimate wind speed, we're talking about, again, 3-second gust, always talking about 3-second gust, whether you're designing for that 3-second gust or you're designing for basic or ASD, it's whatever number you use that matters, right?
Right.
So what we're trying to do is avoid the confusion from manufacturers, especially using the ultimate wind speed as their basic or ASD wind speed. We're trying to avoid that confusion. What I wrote in there was, let me get back to it. Shoot. Okay, it states that all we're doing is adding, so basic, we're talking about basic wind speed again, not ultimate. Wind speeds for say Arvada are 105 mile per hour, parentheses 136 V alt. Okay,
I think the problem is that basic wind speed in terminology for all the structural engineering is the ultimate number. So the confusion is if you want to add wording in here that adds basic wind speed to the definition, you've now just confused it more by adding the term basic wind speed, because for structural engineering purposes, and this section is based on that and references ASCE 7, you've now just kind of discombobulated the whole thing by adding two things that say different numbers.
Okay,
but are
I'm
both
looking
basic
right
wind
out of
speed.
ASCE 7, which says that, I mean, your basic wind speed is V, it's not V alt. So, I mean, but
V
that's
is
okay.
V alt.
That's okay. I mean, I give up on this one. It's just people understanding the difference between V and V alt, which I run into all the time. So and it's what are you going to design for? Your wind speed, basic wind speed is V. Right in ASCE 7, basic wind speed is V, not V alt. V alt is
But
ultimate
V is
wind
V alt.
speed.
That's what I'm saying. V in the current ASCE 7 is V ultimate because they changed the recurrence interval of that 3-second gust. Instead of calculating it for a 50-year wind, they're calculating it for a 700-year wind. So it's a wind storm that's going to occur at 700 years instead of at 50 years. So your wind speed in a 700-year interval goes way up. So the basic wind speed in the current ASCE 7 is V ultimate.
And that is the same as V. V and V
Correct.
ultimate are the same
Correct.
in the ASCE standard.
Which is why in the IBC, in the definitions, they have a wind speed V equals basic wind speed, and wind speed VASD equals the allowable stress design wind speed. That's why they had to have two definitions.
I personally think that if this is mainly showing up in a roofing manufacturer's thing, this is something that could be clarified, like if they're using the old method of calculating different than what the current ASCE 7 is, you have to do the calculation to compare the two. Is that fair? Am I completely missing something?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the definitions, even in ASCE, and they didn't change. I mean, V alt, as far as the design, you're correct. I mean, you're correct about VASD, which makes sense as well to.
It seems like we need a conversion back to that and be like, if the only terminology they're using is VASD, then we have to have a conversion, basically. And the conversion is going backwards.
Right.
Calculating it backwards. We can easily do that in a
So I
handout.
think the problem you're looking at here, and I'm looking right at recent from the SEA and ASCE 7 to help try to describe this problem. And Daniel, believe me, I'm trying to address the same thing here that we run into quite a bit. They still are not the same, but basically what they're saying is that the design wind speed, so it says basic wind speed is V. That's what basic wind speed is. But we're stating in the code here, if I look at that section again, basic wind speed is hereby amended as follows. It's the design wind speed that they're changing to the V alt, not the basic. So what they're trying to do is get rid of the designation for V ultimate and call it design wind speed, so there's less confusion. The problem we have here is we're stating basic wind speed and then we're saying V alt, and that's been the problem with the 2015 code previously. Is the same thing. We could call it basic wind speed. Now if it says design wind speed, it's not an issue. We're giving them the design wind speed, right? The problem is we're saying basic wind speed and then we're giving V alt, which is the ASCE 7 design wind speed, which is basically what you're stating.
So this section should say basic design wind speed instead of basic wind speed.
Yeah, it could, or it could just say design wind speed, but yeah, correct. I mean, it could say, because now, I mean, you're correct in that you're designing for that. I'm just trying to explain the difference between the two that they get caught up with all the time.
Right, but to match the IBC directly, instead of it saying basic wind speed, it should say basic design wind speed, and then
or just make it like ASCE 7 said, just design wind speed, because the basic again is just V. So if we say design wind speed and we give V ultimate, there's no question. Just the design wind speed and it's V ultimate, which is consistent with ASCE 7, 10, and 16. Well, 16 is where they made the changes. So, the definition's the same as 10, but the change for the design is in 16.
So my dilemma about this, honestly, Dan, is that, I mean, we've had this in the code now for a long time, and for all of for chapter 16, for the folks that are referencing it to do building design work for the licensed professionals that are doing it, this makes sense to them based on their day-to-day work with ASCE 7, and that's why I'm kind of, and I've never heard anybody actually, you know, I've not heard one person in this whole time be like, I'm confused by your wind speed, not once, not even a roofing contractor. So I guess I'm a little leery about recommending that we change it, only because for the vast majority of people who are using this that we interact with, they're using it in a way that makes sense to them, and it's written in a way by the code folks that makes sense industry-wide. If there is an industry issue that needs to be resolved, we can clear that up.
Well, I'm just telling you, it's been a problem and it's incorrect, and you know, maybe we've been fortunate, the designers that we're dealing with at the city, but it has been a problem. But don't take my word for it. I mean, we can leave it. I can do whatever anybody wants to do. Just a mess I'm trying to clear up because it's a constant problem.
I've not had it be a problem, and we have an engineer who's, you know.
Well, he understands it.
Well, right? That's what I'm saying.
But even then we had to have a long discussion about the difference between V basic wind speed, design wind speed, V ultimate. You see, there was still confusion there. And that's my point I'm getting to, is there's a lot of confusion in the industry, and yes, ASC is trying to clear that up with 16. It's still new to a lot of guys. And unfortunately, like I said, the biggest issue is with manufacturers, contractors, they don't know one way or the other, Brita. They don't really have a clue with, you know, what the wind speed is. They have to rely on the manufacturer, designer, and the problem we still have is 85–90% of our roofs are designed by the contractor and the manufacturer. I wish they would get engineers involved because they can understand the difference.
You'd hope that the manufacturer would have an engineer involved. I mean, they do. They should be clearing this up, and they probably should have done it 3 years ago. When
well, if you talk to 3 of them on my committee, they'll all tell you the same thing. All 3 manufacturers that design this stuff all day long will tell you the same thing. But we can move on. I mean, forget I brought it up. We'll just leave it. We can maybe clarify it in a handout or something so they understand the difference. That, I mean,
Dan, if you think there's some confusion with the manufacturers, I would recommend you give them my contact information. I can give them wind tunnel guys contact information, and we can sit down and actually
discuss why there was a change and why the definitions stayed the same, and what the actual difference is between the two codes.
Well, and they'll tell you the same thing. The code says basic wind speed, and then it gives you V ultimate, and they're not the same. You know, basic is V, but that's okay. We can move past this.
Any objection? Any objection to moving forward?
Let's move on.
No.
Okay. Dan, do you have anything else? I think we do. One thing, right?
I think the last thing I had was on vapor barriers, Brita.
Okay.
Let's see where that was at.
I think you were talking about energy code.
It's in the energy code. There's a lot of options. I'm trying to find it here.
So the general idea is that when they're using spray foam in a assembly where there's no ventilation, they slice off what is the vapor barrier, the film on the outside of the spray foam, and therefore there's condensation that's happening, and therefore it's causing problems in the roof assembly. Is that kind of the very high level?
The issue is, and I could go on for a day with dozens of examples of how extreme it is, including some pretty large projects that are going on right now, where using SPF foam in the roof cavity, we have one a colleague of mine has been doing this for about 18 years, has been on this project for 2.5 years now. They're getting so much moisture up against the roof deck, and I just looked at one last week down there in Louvers, same problem. SPF foam in the roof cavity. They're assuming 2-pound, 3-pound SPF foam is a proper vapor barrier. Problem with it is you get a lot of cavities and undulations when you spray that SPF foam. And a lot of times they will spray it with a spray applied vapor barrier. What happens is you get vapor drive into those cavities. That SPF foam holds that moisture just like EPS would in EIFS. It's a common problem with EIFS and walls. And the project I'm going to tell you about, it's a very large construction project. They're getting elongation in the top quarter of those 24-foot spans on their trusses, which is their common span on these buildings. They're getting elongation up to 2 inches, which is deflecting the bottom core by 1/2 inch and blowing out those ceilings. And it's because they have conditioned attic space, which is perfectly fine with the energy code. We knew this was going to be a problem when they put this in the energy code, because now we're relying on these perfect vapor barriers. This wasn't a problem when we had leaky homes, right? We didn't have these vapor and air barriers. Now we're getting a lot of vapor drive. I looked at a project this last summer in Denver where the wall was only 5 years old, 5.5 inch studs had rotted 2/3 of the way through. Walls installed with visqueen vapor barrier. Moisture has no place to go. So what we're trying to account for here is that a proper vapor barrier be installed underneath these SPF foam roofs just to avoid this constant problem. Now, it's because they're not using ventilation. So when we gave the option for using a vapor barrier instead of ventilation, that vapor barrier now had to become perfect. These days in construction, that never ever happens. So we're getting extreme vapor drive. So the suggestion is to make a change that a proper vapor barrier be installed, with the use of SPF foam and a non-vented roof cavity or attic space.
So I have a question about that. So a vapor barrier is already required if they don't maintain a approved vapor barrier by virtue of the way that they install the foam. It's a workmanship kind of thing. So if they spray foam,
it's more of an issue of the fallacy of thinking that a 2-pound, 3-pound SPF foam is a proper vapor barrier, because that's the application. And here it would just be a simple designation that it's actually not. It's not a qualified vapor barrier.
So essentially, any closed cell foam that claims to be a vapor barrier integrally is not, and therefore it needs a vapor barrier. So regardless, a vapor barrier is required, is what you're saying.
Vapor barrier is required, yeah, because on its own it's not. They have to look at the system, and that's where it keeps getting misapplied all the time. It's not, and you can't just spray that vapor barrier on. If a film vapor barrier is required, because the code requires you to have a vapor and air barrier, it's not an air barrier either. If you have a proper vapor and air barrier, you solve the problem. Because now with an air barrier, you can be sure that your vapor barrier is functioning properly. The issue is it's not a qualified air barrier, therefore it's not a qualified vapor barrier either. we're getting vapor drive, extreme vapor drive, and I can give you a dozen colleagues that'll give you plenty of the same examples.
Right. So, I
And
mean, I
that's
understand.
the way to resolve it. Yeah.
I understand the issue, but then I'm wondering, so if you require, I mean, because products keep changing. So, so tomorrow comes out a spray applied vapor barrier that actually is listed and tested, and it meets all of those requirements, and they put it in. That's great. Let's say it's not spray applied and it is some sort of film vapor barrier, and now you have a film vapor barrier against a closed cell foam, and you have a gap of some, it's very probably, hopefully very small or nothing. But do you then have problems because now you have one somewhat impermeable and one impermeable element? And then also the problem with film vapor barriers is that they never can be installed tight enough. So
yeah, I mean,
is this just causing another problem by trying to fix a problem is my question. Is this a workmanship thing?
It's a common problem we're running into right now, and trying to figure out an exact solution for it. And you know, my idea is, let's try to maybe come up with a stopgap that'll help solve the problem. Because to solve it really is to keep ventilation in that attic or you know, in that space, but you lose your conditioned space. You know, got a big commercial project now. Right now, the same darn thing's happening. And so, the problem is the SPF foam itself not qualifying as a vapor and air barrier.
The thing I worry about is that we try to create a solution that actually doesn't improve it or makes it worse.
Right.
In the way we do an adoption, because we're trying to do the right thing, but we end up not. And these things are really tricky from what I've experienced because of moisture being very hard to control.
This one's very tricky because it's been accelerated so bad with the energy code, is why we're seeing so many problems now. And you're right, Rita, you know, we don't have an exact solution. You know, that's the only solution we have right now, is to make sure they have a, you know, proper vapor and air barrier. And maybe there's something we can address with a handout too. We're going to need a lot more feedback. I mean, right now we've got, including at the NRCA level, Mark Graham's the one that testifies for us in Congress. You know, kind of also helping with this situation, trying to figure it out. I mean, it just seems premature to try to be fixing it with a local code amendment. It just seems like this is one of those industry / you know, code body / you know, people smarter than me actually getting some additional data and coming up with a solution that actually goes through a test of time. And in the meantime, just being more mindful about workmanship issues as it relates to vapor barriers in general, because I think the code also covers this. It's just being detail oriented about how the installations are done to the best of the people's abilities, both the inspector side and the installer side. That's kind of my personal feeling on this at this point in time. I'm not saying that this solution wouldn't work beautifully, but again, it has its own problems with workmanship, and I'm just concerned about that. Well, I think just by you being aware of it, you know, it helps solve a lot of the issues. And, you know, maybe we can come up with something in the handout that just puts attention to it. And
yeah, maybe
we'll keep working on it. You know, I'm probably going to report here in the next couple of weeks back to Mark Graham, you know, about what we've run in, you know, where we're at right now, and do they have anything new for us?
And maybe it's just a caution, you know, vapor barriers and or ventilation are really important in these kinds of assemblies. We recommend that you know, very carefully consider this before moving forward with your design for your roof. And then people can be like, you know, I'm aware.
I would agree. It's the #1 problem we have right now. Millions and millions of dollars worth of damage. So yeah, I would agree.
Hey, Britta, I agree with you. It could be handled with a handout, but Dan, I want you to know also, I serve on the education committee for the Colorado ICC Code Education Group. Yeah. They have a program that runs about 2,000 building inspectors through in March. And this year, they're going to have 3 specific programs on roofing. And one of those issues, I think, is exactly what you're talking about. So there is an education process there.
In answer to that, Blake, Rich Moon's the one that teaches that, and him and I work closely together every week. And we're the ones that help educate on this stuff. So, and we'll be talking about it before that. And I appreciate you letting me know, because that's one of the things that we're, you know, trying to figure out how to get that out there. Thanks for bringing that up. And you're correct. This year, COVID got in the way, but yeah, next year, hopefully we'll be able to address it.
But also know that there's several means of communicating with building inspectors other than just through the code and through the local building officials. And I believe that plan review and inspectors educated can solve an awful lot of the problems that aren't specific to the code itself.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So,
Dan, did you have anything else?
no, I'm glad we had at least a chance to talk about this stuff, you know, so everybody can be aware of it, and hopefully we'll be able to address these items and make things easier.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. Can I do a quick recap? Because I think we're through, to my knowledge, we're through. You all look tired, and I know I'm tired. So my recap of kind of where we stand is that we made some modifications the last time we met. Those were noted in this version that you received as part of your package. So those are, there may be notes, but the changes were made. The one thing that I noted from tonight that we actually decided to change was to remove section 18-197, which is related to IRC section R905.3.7. And then we still need your feedback on the 2 IRC sections that relate to townhomes and sprinkler systems, and then 1 and 2 family dwellings and sprinkler systems. And I'm going to flip to those sections just so I have them handy. Just give me a second. And I think that covers it. Tell me if I'm missing something.
I think we're good there. Anybody have anything else that was of concern?
Oh, and was there anything in the fire code, Stephen, that we didn't, I'm sorry, Cheryl, I didn't mean to cut you off, but was there anything
That's
in the
okay.
fire code that we needed to resolve
Not that I'm aware of.
from last? I don't think there was either. So, and I don't think we made any changes between, I don't think we recommended any changes to the fire code when in the last meeting. So, sorry, let me flip to that.
In regards to the fire sprinklers, where you are saying it's not going to be adopted as part of this code?
No, I'm saying you guys need to make a decision tonight, and to do that, you will need to, if you want to do modifications to the document that you've got in front of you, or if you want to go one way or the other, you need to include that in any motions you make. So any motion that gets made about recommending this to council would need to include removing section 18-197 and in possibly modifying the 2 sections that relate to the sprinkler systems. And I'm just trying to pull them up here. I'm getting close.
Cheryl, I think we ought to deal with those items first and then adopt the code as written.
So my
you're recommending.
understanding is we need a motion to either recommend or not recommend the code, and then we would need to deal with those items as amendments to that motion.
Okay.
So if there's no further discussion with regard to the code, do I have a consensus from the group to recommend adoption of the code?
To adopt it the way that it is, yes. That's my recommendation.
Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second that motion.
Are there any amendments proposed?
I would amend that we opt out of the sprinkler system at this time. I don't know what the number is. What's my number?
So can you clarify that? So that the section is 18-185, which is 1 and 2 family, sorry, strike that. I'm sorry. So the first section would be 18-184, which relates to sprinkler systems for townhouses. And when you say opt out of it, do you mean remove the amendment, or do you mean leave the amendment as written?
Remove the amendment. I think it's as written that we're going to accept that.
So,
Wait, I'm confused.
so Blake, in the packet that we provided is a cover sheet that has a motion on there. And the motion, I believe, read something like, I move to recommend the adoption of 2018. I can't remember the exact words, but so you want to do that, and then you want to add in the amendment that you want to propose, and then there will be a roll call vote on that, depending if the motion passes with the amendment or not.
So can I do a sample one, or is that passe? I mean, I can't make an amendment, but I can tell you what it would sound like. Is that,
I would
can I do that?
appreciate that. Yes.
Yeah,
Emily,
Yep, as long
Emily,
as
can I do that?
yep, as the chair is okay with that, then that's totally fine.
So I'm good with that.
So I'm not making an amendment, but it would sound something like this. It would be, I move that the 2018, and I would probably spell it out, you know, building code, residential code. You can look at the actual beginning of the document if you want. Be recommended to council with the following amendments: removing section 18-197, removing section blah, 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 removing section blah, 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 blah. And that would be my motion. And then we can do the same thing for the fire code, which is a different, I think we can actually do ordinance chapter 18 if you want to just summarize it as one, and then we'll do ordinance chapter 42 for the fire code. We'll have two different amendments. That probably didn't come out very clean. Did that make sense to you, Blake?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. My only issue is that I want to make it a part of the record that we voted on the amendment about the sprinklers. That's
Okay.
what my concern
And
is.
you
Do we want to leave it the way that it's written already?
We're making it way more difficult than we need to make it. If you want to just talk about the sprinklers and talk about that section and vote on whether or not you want to include that, and if that's easier for people to understand, that's fine. There's no magic rule right now. You guys are just making a recommendation, and we just want to have a clear voting record of what's being recommended. That's all. So you guys, if that makes more sense, just to talk about the sprinklers as a separate item, and decide that before we vote on the whole chapter 18, chapter 42, that's fine.
I think we can make it really easy because we're removing 3 sections, right? We're removing 18-197, 18-184, and 18-185. Correct?
That is
184
correct.
is okay.
That is correct if your intention is to require sprinkler systems in residential townhomes and 1- and 2-family dwellings. If you want to keep that in the code, your amendment was correct.
Right.
Or your motion.
Okay. So is everybody okay with the way I said it? Because I can make the motion, I think, pretty easy. Okay.
I've had it.
Go for it.
All right. I'm going to move to adopt the 2018 International Building and Fire Code amendments with the amendment to remove sections 18-197, 18-184, and 18-185.
Is there a second to that motion?
Cheryl, can you do a roll call vote?
Do we not need a second to the motion first?
You actually do not need a second to the motion.
Okay.
You can just have the motion and then take a vote.
Okay, so we have a motion to recommend to City Council for the approval of the ordinances for Chapter 18 and 42 with the removal of the 3 sections as noted by Daniel. Dan Kupit.
Specifically chapters 18 and 42. Clarification, specifically chapters 18 and 42.
Yes.
Aye.
Well, it's
Yes.
the ordinances of Chapter 18 and 42.
Yes, I agree. Yes.
Jim Johansson.
I don't want to have the, I'd say no if we're putting residential sprinklers in. I'd say no.
Okay. Blake Tomlinson.
I vote no. And again, it's 1845 and 1856 that I have a problem with.
Daniel Yeager.
Yes.
And I, Cheryl Cheney, also vote yes. So there are 3 yeses and 2 nos with 1 absent. Those voting no would be Jim Johansson and Blake Tomlinson. The absent is Dave Rhodes. And on a 3-2 vote, the motion would carry. The next steps with this recommendation for approval would be for the staff to hold a city council workshop, tentatively scheduled for August 10th, I believe. And then the ordinance would go before public hearing, probably around September 4th, the city council meeting around September 14th.
That's correct. We've had some changes to our city council agendas because of COVID and pushing items, but at this point that sounds like that's roughly the schedule we'll be following. I can send out.
Those are.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say I can send out. I'll send out information to all the board members so that you know the dates. You certainly are welcome to attend those if you would like to. You know, obviously, if you're able to and want to, that would be good. If you can't, I understand that's fine too. And then I'm not sure what else is on our agenda.
That should conclude our business unless there's anything else that anybody feels that needs to be discussed tonight. There is no next meeting scheduled at this time. And with no further business to come before the board, we would stand adjourned.
Great work, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Are we off the air, Josie?